A 12-year-old girl watched her father take his final breath on the endless grassland, then sat beside his cooling body for 3 days until a lone Odawa warrior found her half dead from thirst but refusing to leave the man who had carried her across 1,000 miles of wilderness only to die within sight of their promised land. The Nebraska territory stretched like an ocean of green and gold, waves of prairie grass rolling to every horizon under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow sound itself. In this immensity, a covered wagon sat motionless, its canvas top bleached white by the relentless sun, one wheel broken and tilted at an angle that spoke of journeys ended rather than paused.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Beside the wagon, 2 figures lay in the sparse shade cast by its bulk. One had not moved for 3 days. The other, a child with tangled blonde hair and a dress torn by weeks of prairie travel, sat with the stillness of someone who had learned that moving required hope, and hope had bled out somewhere between the Platte River and this godforsaken expanse of nothing. Samuel Hartwick had died as he had lived quietly, without complaint, his weathered hand reaching for his daughters until the very end. The consumption that had been eating at his lungs for months finally won its patient battle just as they crested a low hill and saw, in the distance, the thin line of smoke that marked the settlement of Cedar Falls. They had been so close to their new beginning that Emma could smell wood smoke on the wind when her father began coughing blood that wouldn't stop. Almost there, little prairie flower, he had whispered, using the pet name her mother had given her before the fever took her back in Ohio. Almost home. But home had remained a mirage shimmering just beyond reach while Samuel Hartwick drew his last breath with his daughter's small hand pressed to his chest, feeling his heart flutter and finally still like a bird settling to rest. Emma had tried to be practical at first. She knew they were perhaps 2 miles from Cedar Falls, close enough that she could walk there if she left her father and followed the wagon ruts that scarred the prairie like an old wound. But leaving meant accepting that he was truly gone, and Emma Hartwick was not ready for that acceptance. Not yet. So she stayed. She rationed the last of their water, taking tiny sips that barely wet her cracked lips. She covered her father's face with his spare shirt to keep the flies away, and spoke to him as if he might still hear her, telling him about the red-winged blackbirds that nested in the tall grass, and the way the wind sounded different when it moved through buffalo grass than it had through the oak trees back home. By the second day, her lips were split and bleeding. By the third, she could barely swallow. Her thoughts moved like honey, slow and thick, and sometimes she forgot where she was, or why the man beside her wouldn't wake up no matter how much she shook his shoulder. The prairie sun was merciless, and even the wagon's meager shade felt like standing inside an oven. It was near sunset on the 3rd day when she saw him. At first, Emma thought he was another mirage. The heat had been playing tricks on her eyes for hours, showing her lakes that weren't there and people who dissolved when she blinked. But this figure didn't waver or fade. It moved with purpose across the grassland, a man on horseback riding straight toward her with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this vast emptiness. As he drew closer, Emma could see that he was Indian Odawa. She would learn later, though she knew nothing of tribal distinctions then. He was perhaps 30 years old, with long black hair braided with strips of leather and feathers, and skin the color of burnished copper. He wore white man's clothes, a blue cotton shirt and dark trousers, but they sat on him differently than they would on a settler, as if he had chosen to wear them rather than been forced into them. His horse was a magnificent paint, black and white patches flowing across its hide like spilled ink on snow. The animal moved without sound through the grass, its hooves finding solid ground with the sureness of a creature that had never known fences or roads. Emma tried to stand as the rider approached, but her legs buckled and she fell back to her knees beside her father's still form. Her throat was too dry to call out, so she simply watched as the man brought his horse to a stop 20 feet away and sat studying her, with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. For a long moment, neither moved. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around them, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Emma could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the vast emptiness pressing down on them like the weight of the sky itself. The Odawa man, she would later learn his name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom in his language, though he would not share this with her for many weeks. Dismounted, with a fluid motion that barely disturbed his horse's stance, he approached slowly, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth around the wagon. When he knelt beside Samuel Hartwick's body, Emma found her voice at last, a cracked whisper that barely carried on the wind. "Please don't take him away. I can't leave him here alone." Ayana's eyes moved from the dead man to the child, taking in her sunburned face, her cracked lips, the way she swayed even while sitting. He had been tracking this wagon for 2 days, following the erratic trail it had left across the prairie. He had seen many deaths in his 30 years, his own people claimed by disease and war, settlers claimed by the harsh indifference of the land they tried to tame. But there was something about this child's fierce loyalty to her dead father that struck him like a blow to the chest. He stood and walked to his horse, returning with a water skin that he offered to Emma without ceremony. She stared at it for a moment, not trusting her eyes, then reached out with trembling hands. The water was warm but clean, and she had to force herself to drink slowly despite every instinct screaming at her to drain the entire container. "Easy," Ayana said, the first word he had spoken. His voice was deep, accented with the rhythms of his native tongue but perfectly clear in English. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Emma nodded, lowering the water skin with an effort that spoke of tremendous self-control for a child her age. "Thank you," she whispered. Ayana studied her for a long moment, then looked at Samuel Hartwick's body. The man had been dead for days. That much was obvious from the smell beginning to carry on the wind and the way his skin had taken on a waxy pallor. But the child had stayed with him, had chosen possible death over abandonment. "Your father?" he asked. Emma nodded, fresh tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "He got sick on the trail. We came from Ohio, trying to reach Cedar Falls. He said we'd start over there, that things would be better." Her voice broke. "We were almost there. I could see the smoke from their chimneys." Ayana looked toward the horizon where Emma pointed, seeing the thin line of smoke that marked the settlement. 2 miles, maybe less. So close to safety, yet it might as well have been 200 miles for a child dying of thirst and exposure. "You stayed with him," Ayana said. "It wasn't a question." "I couldn't leave him alone," Emma replied, her voice stronger now that she'd had water. "Mama made me promise, before she died, that I'd take care of Papa and he'd take care of me. I kept my promise." Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a softening around his dark eyes that spoke of understanding deeper than words. He had made similar promises once, to people who were now only memories carried in his heart. The white settlers saw him as savage, uncivilized, but this child's devotion was something he recognized as purely human. Crossing all boundaries of race or culture, he returned to his horse and retrieved a bundle of supplies: dried meat, hardtack, a small pouch of ground corn. He set these beside Emma, then began gathering stones from around the wagon. His movements were efficient, practiced, the motions of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. "What are you doing?" Emma asked, though part of her already knew. "Building a cairn," Ayana replied, selecting stones of the right size and shape. "Your father deserves proper rest, not to be left for the scavengers." Emma watched as he worked, tears flowing freely, now not just of grief, but of gratitude that this stranger understood what her father's dignity meant to her. She tried to help, but her weakened state made even lifting small stones an effort. Ayana noticed and gently took the rock from her hands. "Rest," he said simply. "Eat. I will handle this."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
As the sun sank lower toward the horizon, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber, Ayana carefully wrapped Samuel Hartwick's body in the man's own blankets and began the slow process of building a proper burial mound. The work was hard in the prairie soil, but he persevered with the patient determination of someone who understood that how we honor the dead speaks to who we are among the living. Emma sat nearby, slowly consuming the food he had given her and watching this stranger perform a service that no one had asked him to do, that brought him no benefit except the knowledge that it was right. Her father had taught her to be wary of Indians. The newspapers back in Ohio were full of stories about savage raids and brutal killings. But there was nothing savage about the way Ayana worked, nothing brutal about his careful attention to her father's dignity. When the cairn was complete, Ayana stood and spoke words in his own language, a prayer or blessing that Emma didn't understand, but felt in her bones. The sound of his voice carried across the prairie like music, rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind through grass. "What did you say?" Emma asked when he finished. "I asked the spirits to guide his journey to the next world," Ayana replied. "And I thanked him for raising a daughter brave enough to honor him properly." Fresh tears threatened, but Emma blinked them back. "What happens to me now?" Ayana looked at her, really looked at this 12-year-old girl who had survived 3 days alone on the prairie, who had chosen loyalty over survival, who sat now asking about her future with the straightforward courage of someone much older. "You have people in Cedar Falls?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "Papa said there would be work there, that we could make a new start. But we don't know anyone. We don't have anywhere to go." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky. He thought of his own camp, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods along a creek 10 miles to the north. He thought of the winter coming, of the increasing tension between his people and the white settlers, of the complications that would come from taking in a white child. But he also thought of the promises he had made to his own dead, of the children in his family who had not survived the diseases and conflicts that followed the white man's westward push. He thought of honor, of the responsibility that came with strength, of the Odawa teaching that we are all connected in the great web of life. "I have a place," he said finally. "It is not what you are used to, but it is safe. You would be fed, protected, taught to survive in this land that your people are still learning." Emma studied his face in the gathering darkness, seeing something there that her father would have recognized, the look of a man who had carried responsibility for others and understood its weight. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because you stayed," Ayanna replied simply. "Because when it mattered, you chose love over fear. That is not something to leave alone on the prairie to die." He extended his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma took it. His grip was warm, calloused from years of hard work, but gentle as he helped her to her feet. "My name is Emma Hartwick," she said. "Ayanna," he replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language. That's a beautiful name." "So is Emma. It means universal, complete." Perhaps our meeting was meant to be. As full darkness settled over the prairie, Yazana helped Emma gather what few belongings she could carry from the wagon: her mother's Bible, a small wooden box containing her parents' wedding rings, and a blue calico dress that had been her Sunday best back in Ohio. Everything else, the furniture, the farm tools, the dreams her father had carried west, would remain here on the prairie, returning slowly to the earth. Ayanna lifted Emma onto his horse with the same careful attention he had shown her father's burial. She was light as a bird, all bones and determination, and she settled in front of him on the paint's broad back with the trust of someone who had already seen this stranger's character in his actions. "Are you ready?" he asked. Emma looked back one last time at her father's cairn, already beginning to blend into the prairie landscape in the starlight. "Yes," she said, and meant it. They rode north under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, the rhythm of the horse's gait lulling Emma into a doze despite her grief. Behind them, the broken wagon stood as a monument to dreams deferred, but ahead lay possibilities neither of them could yet imagine. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and indifferent and beautiful, holding secrets in its grass and stories in its wind. Two souls who should have been strangers, an Odawa warrior and a white settler's daughter, rode through that immensity together, bound now by the simple recognition that sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected places. As they rode, Ayanna found himself thinking about the changes coming to this land, about the inevitable conflicts between his people and the wave of settlers pushing ever westward. Taking in this white child would complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet foresee, would raise questions among both his own people and hers about loyalties and intentions. But looking down at the small blonde head, resting against his chest, feeling the trust in the way she relaxed against him, despite everything she had been taught to fear about his kind, Ayanna knew he had made the only choice his honor would allow. The child had shown courage that would shame grown men, had demonstrated the kind of loyalty that his own people prized above all other virtues. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever challenges this decision would bring, Ayanna carried Emma Hartwick away from her father's grave and toward an uncertain future with the certainty that some choices transcend the boundaries others try to build between people. Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't yet learned to accept, that family isn't always about blood, that home isn't always about the place you started, and that love can grow in the most unlikely soil. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, as they rode through the night toward whatever tomorrow would bring. Emma woke to the sound of water running over stones and the smell of wood smoke mixed with something she couldn't identify, herbs, perhaps, or roots cooking in a pot. For a moment, she forgot where she was and reached instinctively for her father's warm presence beside her. But her hand found only empty space and rough buffalo hide, and the memories came flooding back like a dam breaking. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the long ride and days of dehydration. She was lying on a bed of soft furs inside what appeared to be a traditional Odawa lodge. though it was larger than any dwelling she had imagined Indians might use. The walls curved gracefully overhead, supported by wooden poles and covered with carefully sewn hides that had been painted with intricate designs, eagles soaring through clouds, buffalo running across endless grass, and symbols she didn't recognize, but that seemed to tell stories of their own. Sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top of the lodge, casting dancing patterns on the walls as a gentle breeze stirred the hide coverings. The air inside was warm, but not stifling, and Emma could hear voices outside speaking in a language that flowed like music, rising and falling with rhythms completely different from English. "You are awake." The voice belonged to Ayana, who ducked through the lodge entrance carrying a wooden bowl that steamed in the morning air. He had changed from his white man's clothes into traditional Odawa dress, buckskin leggings and shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and a choker made of bone and silver around his throat. Somehow, seeing him in his own clothing made Emma realize how much he had adapted himself to her world when they first met, choosing familiar dress to make himself less threatening to a frightened white child. "How long did I sleep?" Emma asked, accepting the bowl gratefully. It contained a thick soup made with corn, beans, and meat she didn't recognize, but that tasted rich and nourishing after days of starvation. "Through the night and most of the morning," Ayana replied, settling cross-legged beside her sleeping area. "Your body needed time to heal from what you endured." Emma looked around the lodge with curious eyes, taking in details she had been too exhausted to notice when they arrived. In the darkness, beautiful baskets woven from grasses and reeds lined the walls, some holding food stores, others containing tools and clothing. A small fire burned in a ring of stones at the center of the lodge, its smoke rising straight up through the hole. Above, everything was neat, organized, and spoke of a life lived with intention and care. "This is your home?" she asked. Ayana nodded. "For now. My people move with the seasons, following the game and the cycles of the plants we gather. But this place, beside the creek with the cottonwoods, is where I spend the summer months." Emma finished the soup and set the bowl aside, feeling strength returning to her limbs for the first time in days. "Where are your people? Your family?" Something flickered across Ayana's features, pain quickly masked, but not before Emma caught a glimpse of it. "Gone," he said simply. "Disease took most of them 3 winters ago. The ones who survived moved west with other bands, but I chose to stay. This land holds too many memories to abandon." "You're alone too," Emma said softly, recognizing in his voice the same hollowness she had been carrying since her mother's death. "I was," Ayana replied, looking at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people. "Until yesterday." Before Emma could respond to that loaded statement, voices outside the lodge grew louder, and she caught the sound of horses approaching. Ayana's expression immediately grew guarded, and he moved to the lodge entrance with the fluid grace of someone always ready for trouble. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Do not come out unless I call for you." Emma nodded, though anxiety twisted in her stomach as she listened to the conversation that began outside. Even though she couldn't understand the words, she could hear the tension in the voices, several men speaking rapidly in what sounded like urgent, angry tones. Ayana's responses were calm but firm, and she caught her own name mentioned more than once. The discussion continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, she heard horses departing, and Ayana returned to the lodge with a grim expression. "Who were they?" Emma asked. "Members of my clan," Ayana replied, beginning to pack supplies into leather bags with quick, efficient movements. "Word has spread that I have taken in a white child. They are concerned about what this might mean for our people's safety." Emma felt ice forming in her stomach. "They want you to get rid of me." Ayana paused in his packing to look at her directly. "They want me to take you to the settlement at Cedar Falls, as would be expected. They fear that keeping you here will bring trouble from the white authorities, that soldiers might come looking for you and find reasons to cause problems for what remains of our people in this area." "They're probably right," Emma said quietly, though the thought of being handed over to strangers in Cedar Falls filled her with dread. "I don't want to cause problems for you. The choice is not yours to make," Ayana said firmly. "Nor is it theirs. It is mine, and I have decided." "Decided? What?" Ayana continued packing, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was choosing his words. "We cannot stay here. But I will not take you to Cedar Falls to be handed off to people who see you only as a burden or an opportunity. There are other options, such as, there is a trading post 3 days' ride north, run by a French trapper named Baptiste Moreau. He has been fair in his dealings with my people, and he has connections throughout the territory. If you wish, he might help you find suitable placement with a family that would treat you well. Emma considered this, recognizing the kindness in what Ayana was offering. He was giving her choices, not simply disposing of her as his clan members wanted. But something else in his tone suggested there was more to this plan. "And if I don't wish that?" she asked. Ayana stopped packing and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then you would have to be prepared for a very different kind of life. One that would require you to leave behind everything you have known about how white people and Indians are supposed to interact. One that would be difficult, sometimes dangerous, and that many people from both our worlds would never understand or accept." Emma felt her heart racing, though she wasn't entirely sure why. What kind of life? The life of someone who belongs to neither world completely, but who makes her own place between them, Ayana said. "I know hidden valleys where small groups of mixed families live, white traders who married Indian women, half-blood children who fit nowhere else, people who have chosen to live by their own rules rather than the ones others would impose on them." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Emma thought of Cedar Falls, of the life that awaited her there, probably as a servant or ward, to some family that would take her in out of Christian duty, but never really accept her as one of their own. She thought of the narrow, suffocating world of proper white society that had killed her mother's spirit and driven her father to seek a new start on the frontier. "Would you ... would you stay with me?" she asked, the question barely a whisper. Ayana's expression softened, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore around emotions slipped enough for her to see the loneliness he had been carrying. "If you chose that path, yes, I would stay with you, teach you what you need to know to survive in places where white law doesn't reach, help you become strong enough to make your own decisions about your future when you are old enough to understand all that such decisions might cost." Emma looked around the lodge that had sheltered her through her first night of safety since her father's death. She thought about Ayana's gentle strength, the way he had honored her father's memory, the respect he had shown for her grief and her choices. In less than 24 hours, the stranger had shown her more genuine care than she had received from most of the white people she had known back in Ohio. "I don't want to go to Cedar Falls," she said firmly. "I don't want to be handed off to people who will see me as a charity case or a burden. I want to stay with you." Ayana studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was a decision made from fear and desperation or from genuine conviction. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "Then we leave within the hour," he said, resuming his packing. "The men who were here will return with others if we do not move quickly. And Emma," he paused to look at her seriously, "once we take this path, there will be no going back to the life you might have had. Are you certain this is what you want?" Emma thought of her father's words during their last conversation, about how sometimes people had to leave everything behind to find where they truly belonged. She thought about the promise she had made to her mother to take care of herself and make choices that honored the strength both her parents had tried to give her. "I'm certain," she said. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Ayana helped Emma select the most practical items from her few belongings, trading her torn dress for a simpler outfit of buckskin that would be more suitable for travel. He showed her how to pack a travel bundle efficiently, how to secure supplies on a horse, and how to move quietly to avoid drawing attention. As they prepared to leave, Emma asked the question that had been nagging at her since the morning's confrontation with his clan members. "Will you be able to come back here? To this place?" Ayana looked around the lodge that had been his home, his eyes lingering on the painted symbols that told the story of his people's connection to this land. "Probably not," he said quietly. "By choosing to take you with me, I am choosing exile from what remains of my clan. They will not welcome me back while you are with me, and perhaps not even after." The weight of what he was sacrificing hit Emma like a physical blow. "I can't let you give up your home, your people, for me. It's too much." "It is not too much," Ayana replied firmly. "My people are already scattered, already diminished. This place is full of ghosts of those who are gone. Perhaps it is time for me to stop living with ghosts and start living with the choices that lead to new life." He moved to one of the painted walls and carefully cut away a small section of hide bearing the image of an eagle in flight. He rolled it carefully and tucked it into his travel pack. "I take the important things with me," he said. "The rest are just possessions." They led Ayana's horses out of the cottonwood grove as the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows on the prairie grass. Emma rode on a gentle mare that Ayana said had belonged to his sister, while he rode his paint stallion and led a pack horse carrying their supplies. As they crested the first ridge beyond the creek, Emma looked back at the grove of trees that had sheltered Ayana's lodge. Already, it seemed impossibly distant, like something from a dream rather than the place where she had spent her first night of safety. Do you regret it? Ayana asked, following her gaze. Emma considered the question seriously. In choosing to go with Ayana, she was choosing uncertainty over security, adventure over convention, a future written in her own hand rather than dictated by others' expectations. It was exactly the kind of choice her father had been trying to make when he loaded their wagon and headed west. No, she said firmly, I don't regret it. They rode north across the prairie under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The grass around them was beginning to show the first hints of autumn color, and the air carried the promise of changing seasons. Behind them lay everything Emma had ever known about who she was supposed to be. Ahead lay the vast unknown of who she might choose to become. As they traveled, Ayana began teaching her things she would need to know for the life they were choosing: how to read the weather in the color of clouds, how to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to move through the landscape without leaving obvious signs of their passage. The white world teaches children to conquer the land, he said, as they paused to rest the horses near a small stream. My people teach children to live as part of the land. You will need to learn both ways if you are to survive between worlds. Emma nodded, absorbing this lesson along with the countless others he had been sharing throughout the day. She was beginning to understand that survival in the life they were choosing would require more than just physical skills. It would require a completely different way of thinking about her place in the world. That evening, they made camp in a hidden valley that Ayana said was known only to a few trappers and traders who could be trusted to keep secrets. As they sat around their small fire, eating the simple meal Ayana had prepared, Emma found herself studying his face in the flickering light. Why did you really decide to take me with you? She asked. It wasn't just because I stayed with my father, was it? Ayana was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory. That made her understand she was hearing something he had never shared with anyone else. I had a daughter once, he said quietly. Her name was Nokoma's little grandmother. She was about your age when the sickness came. I watched her die slowly, day by day, while I could do nothing to help her. When she was gone, I thought I would never again know what it felt like to want to protect someone, to feel responsible for another person's future. He looked at Emma across the fire, and she could see the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes. When I found you sitting beside your father's body, refusing to abandon him even though it might cost you your life, I saw the same fierce spirit that my daughter had possessed. The same courage that my people prize above all other virtues. And I realized that maybe the spirits had brought us together for reasons neither of us yet understands. Emma felt tears stinging her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of understanding that sometimes the family we need is not the one we are born into, but the one we choose to create. I'm honored, she said simply, to remind you of her. You do more than remind me, Ayana replied. You help me remember that there is still good reason to hope for the future. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new uncertainties. But tonight, for the first time since her father's death, Emma felt like she was exactly where she belonged between two worlds, perhaps but no longer alone in either one. The trading post of Baptist Moreau sat like a fortress of rough-hewn logs at the confluence of two rivers, its palisade walls rising from the prairie grassland like something from another world entirely. Smoke drifted from multiple chimneys, and Emma could hear the sounds of activity even from a distance: horses nickering, men shouting in French and English, the ring of hammer on anvil from what must be a blacksmith shop. Remember, Ayana said quietly as they approached the main gate, you are my ward, taken in after your family died on the trail. Nothing more complicated than that, at least until we know who can be trusted. Emma nodded, though her stomach churned with nervousness. After 3 days of traveling through the wilderness with only Ayana for company, the prospect of encountering a settlement full of strangers felt overwhelming. She had grown comfortable in their routine of quiet travel, evening lessons about survival, and the easy companionship that had developed between them. Now they would have to pretend to be something simpler than what they were becoming. The gates of the trading post stood open to accommodate the steady flow of traffic: French voyageurs with canoes full of furs, white settlers heading west with their families and possessions, and various Indian traders from different tribes bringing goods to exchange. It was a chaotic blend of cultures and languages that made Emma's head spin, but she noticed that Ayana seemed to relax as they rode through the entrance. "Baptist runs an honest trading post," he explained as they dismounted near the main building. "Here, what matters is the quality of your goods and the fairness of your dealings, not the color of your skin or which god you pray to." The main building was a sprawling structure that seemed to have grown organically over the years, with additions and extensions branching off in all directions. Signs painted in multiple languages advertised everything from finest beaver pelts to ammunition and gunpowder to medicinal herbs and remedies. The wide front porch was crowded with men of various nationalities engaged in heated negotiations over trade goods. Baptiste Moreau himself emerged from the building as they approached, a bear of a man with graying black hair, a beard that reached nearly to his chest and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was dressed in a mixture of French and frontier clothing, with a bright red sash around his waist and moccasins on his feet that suggested he had spent considerable time among Indian peoples. "Ayana, mon ami," Baptiste called out in accented English, spreading his arms wide in welcome. "It has been too long since you have graced my humble establishment. And who is this young lady you have brought to visit old Baptiste?" "This is Emma," Ayana replied carefully. "Her family was lost on the trail. I found her and have been caring for her." Baptiste's sharp eyes moved between them, and Emma had the distinct impression that he was seeing far more than Ayana's simple explanation revealed. But his expression remained jovial as he stepped forward to take Emma's hand in both of his massive ones. "Mademoiselle Emma, you are most welcome here," he said with a slight bow that somehow managed to convey both respect and genuine warmth. "Any friend of Ayana's is a friend of Baptiste Moreau. Come, you must be tired and hungry from your journey. Marie will prepare rooms for you, and tonight you will dine at my table and tell me all the news from the south." Marie turned out to be Baptiste's wife, a Metis woman whose French father and Cree mother had given her the ability to move seamlessly between the various cultures that converged at the trading post. She was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and capable hands that spoke of a lifetime spent managing the complex logistics of frontier hospitality. "Poor child," Marie murmured as she led Emma to a small but comfortable room on the second floor of the main building. "You have the look of someone who has seen too much sorrow for her age. But you are safe here, ma petite. Baptiste and I, we have seen many lost souls find their way at this trading post." The room was simple but clean, with a real bed covered in colorful quilts, a washstand with fresh water, and a window that looked out over the river. After days of sleeping on the ground, the prospect of a soft mattress and privacy felt almost luxurious to Emma. "There are clothes in the chest there," Marie continued, indicating a wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. "They belong to my daughter, before she married and moved west with her husband. Perhaps some will fit you better than what you are wearing." Emma looked down at the buckskin outfit Ayana had given her, which was practical for travel, but decidedly out of place in a settlement, where most white women wore dresses and bonnets. "Thank you," she said gratefully. "That's very kind. We take care of our own here," Marie replied simply. "And anyone Ayana brings to us is one of our own. That man has more honor in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies." After Marie left, Emma explored the contents of the trunk and found several dresses that looked like they might fit her. She selected a simple blue cotton dress with white collar and cuffs, and for the first time in weeks, she looked in a mirror and saw something approaching the respectable young lady her parents had raised her to be, but the reflection felt strange, like she was looking at someone she used to know but no longer quite recognized. The girl in the mirror had harder eyes than she remembered, and a set to her jaw that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed that could never be uncrossed. That evening, Emma joined Ayana and the Moreau family for dinner in the main room of the trading post. The meal was a fascinating blend of French cooking techniques, frontier ingredients, and Indian seasonings that reflected the cultural mixing pot that was Baptiste's domain. Other guests included a French trapper heading back to Montreal with a fortune in beaver pelts, a Methodist minister and his wife traveling to establish a mission in Oregon Territory, and a grizzled mountain man who spoke in a mixture of English, Spanish, and what sounded like at least 3 different Indian languages. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine Baptiste poured from his personal stock, and Emma found herself fascinated by the stories being shared around the table. These were people who lived on the edges of the expanding American frontier, who made their livings by navigating the complex relationships between different cultures and competing territorial claims. "The railroad surveyors came through last month," the mountain man was saying, gesturing with a chicken leg for emphasis, marking routes for the iron horse to follow. They say within 10 years, a man will be able to travel from New York to California without ever leaving the train. Bah, Baptiste snorted. They have been saying this for 20 years. The distances are too great, the mountains too high, the Indians too hostile. Mark my words, the frontier will remain the frontier for many years to come. Perhaps, the Methodist minister interjected diplomatically. But surely the advance of civilization and Christian values is inevitable. It is our duty to bring light to the darkness of the wilderness. Emma noticed Ayana's jaw tighten at this comment, though he said nothing. Marie, however, was less restrained. And what of the people who already live in this supposed darkness? She asked pointedly. My mother's people have been here for thousands of years. They have their own light, their own values. Why do you assume yours are better? The minister looked uncomfortable. Well, naturally, the heathen peoples have their own customs. But surely you cannot argue that Christian civilization represents a higher form of human development. I can argue exactly that, Ayana said quietly, speaking for the first time since the conversation had taken this turn. I have seen your Christian civilization's achievements in the villages of my people. Disease, broken treaties, children stolen and forced into schools where they are beaten for speaking their own language. If that is civilization, I prefer barbarism. An awkward silence fell over the table. The minister and his wife exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering the wisdom of traveling through territory where such dangerous ideas were openly expressed. Baptiste cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should speak of other matters, he suggested. Monsieur Williams, tell us about the fur prices in St. Louis this season. As the conversation shifted to safer topics, Emma found herself studying the faces around the table. Here was a microcosm of the larger conflicts playing out across the American frontier, competing visions of progress and civilization, different definitions of what it meant to live a good life, and the inevitable tensions that arose when expanding settlement met established ways of life. After dinner, Baptiste invited Ayana and Emma to join him for coffee on the porch while the other guests retired to their rooms. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the sounds of the river and the distant howling of wolves that reminded Emma how thin the veneer of civilization really was in this place. So, Baptiste said, settling into a wooden chair that creaked under his weight, tell me what really brought you here, mon ami. And do not insult my intelligence with simple stories about finding orphaned children on the trail. Ayana was quiet for a moment, then gave Baptiste a condensed version of how he had found Emma and the complications that had arisen with his clan. Baptiste listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. Ah, he said when Ayana finished. You seek sanctuary for the child while you determine what the future holds. Something like that, Ayana agreed. And you, ma petite, Baptiste said, turning to Emma. What do you seek? Emma considered the question carefully. It was the first time since leaving Ayana's camp that any adult had asked her directly about her own desires rather than simply making decisions on her behalf. I want to stay with Ayana, she said simply. He saved my life, and I trust him. But I also want to learn about this land, about different ways of living, about who I might become if I'm not forced into the mold others have prepared for me. Baptiste smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. You have chosen. Well, both of you. But you should know there are complications approaching that will test that choice. What kind of complications? Ayana asked, his voice sharpening with concern. Word has reached me that a U.S. Army patrol is heading this way, investigating reports of Indian raiders taking white captives. Someone, I suspect it was members of your former clan, has spread the story that a white child was kidnapped by a rogue Odawa warrior. Emma felt ice forming in her stomach. But that's not what happened. Of course not, Baptiste agreed. But the truth and what people choose to believe are often very different things. The army will arrive here within a day or two, and they will be looking for exactly what they will find. An Indian man traveling with a white child. Ayana stood and began pacing the porch, his mind clearly racing through options and implications. They will take her, he said grimly. Regardless of what she wants or what really happened. To them, I will be a savage who stole a white child. And she will be a victim who needs to be rescued and returned to her own kind. Not necessarily, Baptiste said slowly. There may be another way, but it would require both of you to make some difficult choices. What kind of choices? Emma asked. Baptiste looked at both of them seriously. There's a family here, the Rousseaus. Pierre is a French trader, and his wife Celeste is half Ojibwe. They have been trying to have children for years without success. And they are good people who understand the complexities of living between cultures. If Emma were to become their adopted daughter, legally and officially, the army would have no grounds to remove her. And Ayana? Emma asked immediately. Pierre has been looking for a partner in his trading ventures into Sioux territory. Someone who understands Indian customs and can negotiate fair deals. It would give Ayana a legitimate reason to be here. And a way to remain close to you without raising suspicions about improper relationships. Emma looked at Ayana, trying to read his expression in the lamplight. The plan would give them safety and legitimacy, but it would also mean accepting a fiction about their relationship that felt like a betrayal of what they had begun to build together. What do you think? She asked him. Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring out at the river where moonlight painted silver paths across the moving water. I think, he said finally, that survival sometimes requires accepting compromises that our hearts rebel against. But if it means keeping you safe and giving us time to discover what the future might hold, then perhaps it is a compromise worth making. Would the Rousseaus be kind to me? Emma asked Baptiste. They would love you as their own, Baptiste assured her. And you would learn much from Celeste about navigating life between two cultures. She understands the challenges you will face in ways that few others could. Emma thought about the army patrol approaching, about the accusation of kidnapping that could destroy both her and Ayana, about the narrow range of choices available to a 12-year-old girl in 1850s America. Then she thought about her father's last words about sometimes having to leave everything behind to find where you truly belonged. If we do this, she said slowly, would I still be able to spend time with Ayana? Would he still be able to teach me the things I need to learn? Pierre and Ayana would be business partners, Baptiste said. It would be natural for you to see him regularly, to learn about the cultures and languages that would be useful in the trading business. And as you grow older, as you prove your ability to make your own choices, well, the future holds many possibilities. Emma nodded slowly. It wasn't the life she had envisioned when she chose to leave Ayana's camp with him, but it was a way forward that preserved what mattered most: their connection, their ability to remain in each other's lives, and her freedom to eventually choose her own path. When would we need to decide? Ayana asked. Tonight, Baptiste replied grimly. The army will be here by tomorrow afternoon, and these arrangements take time to appear legitimate. If we are going to do this, we must begin immediately. Emma looked at Ayana one more time, seeing in his face the same mixture of reluctance and determination that she felt in her own heart. They were about to step into a more complex deception, but one that might preserve their chance for a genuine future together. Let's do it, she said firmly. Let's find the Rousseaus. The adoption papers were still drying when the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon, announcing the arrival of Captain Marcus Blackwood and his patrol of 12 cavalry soldiers. Emma watched from the window of her new room in the Rousseau household as the blue-uniformed riders approached the trading post, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust that caught the afternoon sunlight like golden smoke. Remember, ma chérie, Celeste Rousseau said softly, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. You have been with us for 6 months. Your parents died of cholera on the trail, and Pierre found you at Fort Laramie when we were trading there. You are grieving, you are shy, and you do not like to speak of your past. Can you do this? Emma nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. In the 18 hours since Baptiste had proposed this desperate masquerade, she had been transformed from Emma Hartwick, orphaned settler's daughter traveling with an Odawa warrior, into Emma Rousseau, adopted daughter of a respectable French métis trading family. The legal documents were genuine. Baptiste had connections with territorial officials, who owed him favors and asked few questions. But the emotional reality of the deception felt like a betrayal of everything she and Ayana had built together. Pierre Rousseau was a compact, energetic man in his 40s with graying brown hair and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a naturally jovial disposition. But there was steel beneath his cheerful exterior, and Emma had already seen how he commanded respect from the various traders and travelers who passed through the post. He would be a good protector, she knew. But she missed the quiet strength of Ayana's presence. Where is Ayana? She asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. He is meeting with Baptiste about the trading expedition to Sioux territory, Celeste replied. He will be introduced to the soldiers as Pierre's new business partner, nothing more. You may see him, of course, but you must remember, he is no longer your guardian. He is simply a man who works with your adoptive father. The formal distance those words imposed felt like a physical pain in Emma's chest. She had grown accustomed to Ayana's steady presence, to their evening conversations about the world beyond the settlements, to the way he looked at her as if she were capable of great things rather than simply another burden to be managed. Now she would have to pretend that he meant nothing to her beyond a business acquaintance of her new family. The cavalry patrol rode into the trading post compound. With military precision, their captain dismounting and immediately beginning to survey the scene with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Captain Blackwood was a man in his 30s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years on the frontier. His uniform was dusty from travel but meticulously maintained, and the way he carried himself suggested both competence and an inflexible adherence to duty. Emma watched from behind the lace curtains as Cotons Baptiste approached the captain with his characteristic blend of deference and authority. Even from a distance, she could see that this was a man who would not be easily fooled or diverted from his mission. "Captain Blackwood," Baptiste said loudly enough for his voice to carry across the compound. "Welcome to my humble trading post. How may we serve the United States Army today?" "Monsieur Moreau," the captain replied formally, "I am investigating reports of a white child taken captive by hostile Indians in this region. We have information suggesting that an Odawa warrior may have kidnapped a young girl from a wagon train and is holding her somewhere in this territory." "Mon Dieu," Baptiste exclaimed, his performance of shocked surprise perfectly calibrated. "A kidnapping? But this is terrible. Of course, we will assist you in any way possible. Please, you and your men must accept our hospitality while you conduct your investigation." Emma felt Celeste's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder, a reminder to stay calm and play her role. Through the window, she could see Pierre emerging from the main building with Ayana walking beside him. Her breath caught at the sight of him, and she had to force herself to remember that she was supposed to be a grieving adopted daughter, not a girl whose heart raced at the sight of a particular man. Ayana had changed, his appearance since their arrival at the trading post. Gone were the traditional Odawa clothes and braided hair. Instead, he wore the practical garb of a frontier trader: dark trousers, white cotton shirt, and a leather vest that concealed the knife he always carried. His long hair was tied back in a simple tail, and he had somehow managed to project an air of civilized respectability that would make him seem less threatening to the military patrol. "Captain," Pierre said as he approached the group, "allow me to introduce my new business partner, Joseph Ayana. He has extensive experience trading with the various tribes in this region and has agreed to assist me in expanding our operations into Sioux territory." Captain Blackwood studied Ayana with obvious suspicion. "Ayana is an Indian name, is it not?" "Half-blood," Ayana replied calmly, his English carefully modulated to sound educated and non-threatening. "My father was French, my mother Odawa. I was educated at the mission school in Michigan Territory before entering the trading business." Emma was amazed at how easily the lie rolled off his tongue, how completely he had adapted himself to fit the role they needed him to play. It was a masterful performance, but it also reminded her painfully of how much of himself he was having to suppress to keep them both safe. "I see," the captain said, though his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. "And you have been in this area for how long?" "I arrived here 2 weeks ago to finalize the partnership with Monsieur Rousseau," Ayana replied. "Before that, I was trading along the Missouri River Valley. I can provide references from army posts and Indian agents throughout the region if necessary." Baptiste stepped forward smoothly. "Joseph comes highly recommended, Captain. His reputation for fair dealing has reached even my ears, and you know how difficult it is to earn such respect in the trading business." The captain nodded slowly, but Emma could see that he was not entirely satisfied. His gaze swept the compound, taking in the various buildings and the people going about their daily business. "I will need to interview everyone who has been in this area during the past month," he said. "Anyone who might have seen signs of Indian raiders or heard reports of missing settlers." "Of course," Baptiste agreed. "We are all eager to assist in finding this poor child. But first, you and your men must be exhausted from your journey. Marie is preparing quarters for you, and tonight you will dine with us. Tomorrow we can begin the interviews with fresh minds and full stomachs." Captain Blackwood clearly wanted to begin his investigation immediately, but frontier courtesy demanded that he accept Baptiste's hospitality. He nodded curtly. "Very well. But I want to make it clear that this investigation is a priority of the United States Army. Anyone found to be harboring kidnappers or impeding our efforts will face serious consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire. Emma felt Celeste's hand squeeze her shoulder gently, a reminder that they were all walking on very thin ice. That evening's dinner was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to present the appearance of a normal, law-abiding frontier community. Emma sat between Pierre and Celeste, playing the role of their shy adopted daughter to perfection. She spoke only when directly addressed, kept her eyes downcast, and managed to project an air of grief-stricken fragility that made Captain Blackwood's expression soften whenever he looked at her. Ayanna sat at the opposite end of the table, discussing trading routes and market prices with Pierre in a conversation that was technically genuine, but felt painfully artificial to Emma. She found herself stealing glances at him throughout the meal, memorizing the way the lamplight caught the angular planes of his face, the graceful movement of his hands as he gestured while speaking. "And your daughter," Captain Blackwood said suddenly, addressing Pierre but looking at Emma. "She seems quite reserved. Has she been with you long?" "6 months," Pierre replied smoothly. "Poor little one. She lost her parents to cholera on the trail. We found her at Fort Laramie, all alone in the world. Celeste and we could not bear to see such a sweet child without family." "How fortunate for her," the captain said, his tone suggesting genuine sympathy. "The frontier can be especially cruel to orphan children. She is lucky to have found such caring guardians." Emma forced herself to smile tremulously and murmur a quiet, "Thank you, sir," while inside she felt like a fraud. The kindness in the captain's voice made her deception feel even more wrong, but she reminded herself that the alternative, being rescued from Ayanna and handed over to strangers who would never understand their relationship, was far worse. "Tell me," Captain Blackwood continued, turning back to Pierre, "have you heard any reports of Indian troubles in this region? Raids, missing persons, unusual tribal activity?" Pierre shook his head. "Nothing unusual, Captain. The tribes in this area have been quite peaceful this season. Good trading weather, you know, everyone benefits when goods flow freely and no one is looking over their shoulder for trouble." "What about you, Ayanna?" the captain asked, using Ayanna's name with slight emphasis that suggested he was still suspicious of the man's background. "In your travels, have you encountered any hostile Indians or heard stories of captives being taken?" Ayanna met the captain's gaze steadily. "The opposite, actually. Most of the tribal leaders I've dealt with are more concerned about protecting their own people from white raiders than they are about attacking settlers. The stories that reach army posts are often exaggerated by people who profit from military intervention." Captain Blackwood's eyebrows rose at this direct challenge to army intelligence. "You seem remarkably well informed about Indian motivations, Monsieur Ayanna." "It's my business to understand the people I trade with," Ayanna replied calmly. "Fear and misunderstanding are bad for commerce. I find that most conflicts arise from miscommunication rather than genuine hostility." Emma held her breath, worried that Ayanna was pushing too hard against the captain's preconceptions. But Baptiste smoothly redirected the conversation to safer topics, and the meal continued without further incident. Later that evening, as the trading post settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The room they Rousseau's had given her was comfortable and safe, but it felt like a prison after weeks of sleeping under the stars with Ayanna nearby. She missed their evening conversations, missed the way he would check the perimeter of their camp before settling down for the night, missed the sense of shared purpose that had been growing between them. Unable to bear the confinement any longer, she slipped out of her room and made her way quietly to the back porch of the main building. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass, and the sound of the river provided a soothing backdrop to her troubled thoughts. "Cannot sleep either." Emma spun around to find Ayanna emerging from the shadows near the stable. He moved with the fluid silence that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, but tonight there was a tension in his posture that spoke of carefully controlled emotion. "I keep thinking this is all wrong," Emma whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Pretending we barely know each other, acting like you're just some business associate of Pierre's. It feels like we're betraying everything that's real between us." Ayanna stepped closer, close enough that she could see the conflict in his dark eyes. "It is wrong," he agreed quietly. "But it is necessary. That captain is not a fool, Emma. He suspects something about our story, and if he discovers the truth—" "I know," Emma said, though every fiber of her being rebelled against the need for this deception. "I just hate having to pretend that you don't matter to me." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression at those words, a softening that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, the careful distance he had been maintaining all day crumbled, and she saw the man who had carried her away from her father's grave, who had chosen exile from his own people rather than abandon her. "You matter to me too," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "More than is wise, perhaps. More than is safe for either of us." They stood looking at each other in the moonlight, both of them acutely aware of the dangerous ground they were approaching. Emma was no longer the half-dead child he had rescued. From the Prairie weeks of good food and safety had restored her health and allowed her natural beauty to emerge. At 13, she was still a child in many ways, but she was also beginning the transformation into womanhood, and Ayana was not blind to the changes in her. "Captain Blackwood will be gone soon," Emma said, stepping closer despite the voice in her head that warned her to maintain distance. "And then we can stop pretending, can't we? We can go back to being ourselves." Ayana's hands clenched at his sides, and she could see him fighting an internal battle between desire and duty, between what he wanted and what he knew was right. "Emma," he said carefully, "you need to understand something. What we are becoming. What I am beginning to feel for you. It cannot be. You are 13 years old. I am 30. You are white. I am Indian. You deserve a future with someone who can give you the life you should have: marriage, children, a place in respectable society. I can offer you none of those things." "I don't want respectable society," Emma said fiercely. "I want you. I want the life we were building together before we had to come here and pretend to be something we're not." The pain in Ayana's eyes was almost unbearable to see. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "You don't understand what it would cost you to choose that path. The world will never accept us, Emma. Never. We would be outcasts from both our peoples, always looking over our shoulders, always having to justify our existence to those who would rather see us destroyed than together." "Then we'll live away from the world," Emma replied stubbornly. "In the hidden places you told me about, with the other people who don't fit anywhere else. We'll make our own rules, our own life." Ayana reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness. "You are so young," he murmured. "So brave and fierce and beautiful. But you are still a child, no matter how much you want to be grown. And I am a man who has seen too much of the world's cruelty to burden a child with an impossible love." Emma felt tears stinging her eyes, but they were tears of frustration rather than sadness. "I'm not a child," she protested. "I've made my own choices, faced my own dangers. I chose to stay with my father until he died. I chose to go with you instead of walking to Cedar Falls. I chose to leave your camp when your clan threatened us. When do my choices start to matter?" "They matter," Ayana said firmly. "They have always mattered. But some choices cannot be unmade, Emma. Once we cross certain lines, there is no going back. And I will not be the one to take away your chance for a different kind of happiness." Before Emma could respond, the sound of boots on the wooden porch made them both freeze. Captain Blackwood emerged from the main building, apparently taking a late-night walk to clear his head after the evening's rich meal. "Good evening," he said, his sharp eyes taking in their proximity and the intimate tone of their conversation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just discussing tomorrow's trading expedition," Ayana replied smoothly, stepping back from Emma with the casual air of someone who had nothing to hide. Miss Rousseau was curious about the routes we'll be taking into Sioux territory. "Indeed?" the captain said, his tone suggesting polite interest mixed with suspicion. "That seems like an unusual topic for a young lady to find fascinating." "Emma has always been interested in our business," Pierre's voice said from behind the captain as he too emerged onto the porch. "She has a quick mind for trade routes and tribal customs. Celeste says she may have a future as a trader herself, if such things were more acceptable for women." Captain Blackwood nodded, but Emma could see that he was filing away every detail of this encounter for future consideration. The man was too experienced not to sense the undercurrents of emotion flowing between her and Ayana, even if he couldn't yet interpret what they meant. "Well," the captain said finally, "I should return to my quarters. Tomorrow will be a busy day of interviews and investigation. Good night to you all." As the captain disappeared back into the building, Pierre fixed Ayana with a look that conveyed both understanding and warning. "Perhaps," Pierre said quietly, "it would be best if business discussions were conducted during daylight hours, when there is less chance of misunderstanding." Ayana nodded curtly. "Of course. Good night, Monsieur Rousseau, Miss Rousseau." The formal address felt like a slap, but Emma understood the necessity of it. As Ayana melted back into the shadows and Pierre escorted her to her room, she realized that their stolen moment of honesty had only made their situation more dangerous. Captain Blackwood was already suspicious, and any hint of impropriety between her and Ayana could destroy the careful fiction they had constructed. But as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the night, Emma's mind kept returning to the look in Ayana's eyes when he had touched her face, to the pain in his voice when he spoke of impossible love. He was trying to protect her from a choice he believed would destroy her future, But what he didn't understand was that he had already become her future. Everything else was just marking time until she was old enough to claim what her heart already knew belonged to her. The masquerade they were playing might fool Captain Blackwood and the rest of the world, but it could not change the truth that was growing between them like a wildfire in dry grass, dangerous, uncontrollable, and capable of consuming everything in its path. The crisis began with a letter that arrived 3 days after Captain Blackwood had departed, apparently satisfied that no kidnapped white children were being harbored at the trading post. The messenger was a young Pawnee scout who rode his exhausted horse into the compound at dawn, clutching a leather pouch that bore the official seal of the territorial governor. Emma watched from the window of the Rousseau house as Baptiste received the dispatch, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he read. Within minutes, he was striding toward their door with the purposeful gait of a man bearing bad news that could not wait. "Pierre, Celeste," Baptiste called as he knocked, though he entered without waiting for permission, in the frontier manner of old friends. "We have a problem. A serious one." Pierre emerged from the kitchen still wearing his morning coat, while Celeste appeared at the top of the stairs in her dressing gown. Emma crept to the landing where she could hear the conversation below while remaining unseen. "What is it, mon ami?" Pierre asked, pouring coffee for Baptiste without being asked. Baptiste unfolded the letter with hands that Emma noticed were not entirely steady. "This comes from Governor Ramsey himself, forwarded through 3 different army posts to reach us. It seems our friend Captain Blackwood was not as convinced by our little performance as we hoped." "What does it say?" Celeste asked, descending the stairs with the quiet grace that marked all her movements. "It says that the good captain has done some investigating since leaving here," Baptiste replied grimly. "He tracked down members of Ayana's former clan, and they were very eager to tell him exactly what happened, how their warrior brother abandoned his people to steal away with a white child, how they tried to reason with him but he fled in the night like a guilty man." Emma felt ice forming in her stomach. She had known this moment might come, but the reality of discovery still hit her like a physical blow. "There's more," Baptiste continued. "The captain also made inquiries at Fort Laramie about the cholera victims from 6 months ago. Apparently, his memory for details is better than we gave him credit for. There was no Emma Rousseau among the survivors, and no record of Pierre taking in an orphan child." Pierre sank into a chair, running his hands through his graying hair. "So he knows the adoption papers are fraudulent." "Worse," Baptiste said. "He knows that we deliberately deceived a federal investigation. Governor Ramsey is sending a full company of soldiers to arrest Ayana for kidnapping and to remove Emma to a proper Christian household in the territorial capital. They'll be here within the week." Emma's hands gripped the stair railing so tightly her knuckles went white. After weeks of carefully constructed safety, their world was about to come crashing down around them. And this time, there would be no Baptiste to arrange a clever solution, no friendly French traders to provide legal cover. This time, the full weight of territorial authority was bearing down on them. "Where is Ayana now?" Celeste asked quietly. "Out, checking the trap lines with young Henry," Baptiste replied. "But when he returns this afternoon," he shrugged expressively, "what can we tell him? That his choice to save a child's life will be repaid with a hangman's noose." Emma could bear to listen no longer. She crept back to her room, closed the door quietly, and began to pace like a caged animal. Her mind raced through possibilities, options, escape routes. They could run again, of course disappear into the wilderness before the soldiers arrived. But where could they go? How could they survive with the entire territorial government hunting them? More importantly, how could she live with herself knowing that Ayana would spend the rest of his life as a fugitive because he had chosen to save her rather than leave her to die beside her father's body? The answer came to her with crystalline clarity, terrible in its simplicity. There was one way to solve this problem, one sacrifice that could save them both. It would cost her everything she had begun to hope for, but it would give Ayana back his freedom and his future. She had to confess, not the careful half-truths they had been telling, but the complete truth, that she had chosen to go with Ayana, that she had never been kidnapped or coerced, that every decision had been her own. If she presented herself to the authorities as a willing participant rather than a victim, they could not justify hanging Ayana for kidnapping. Of course, they would never believe a 13-year-old girl capable of making such decisions. They would assume she had been manipulated, brainwashed, or worse. They would take her away from Ayana anyway, but at least he would live. He would be free to return to what remained of his people, or to start over somewhere else without the shadow of federal persecution following him. It was. Emma realized the only gift she could give him that would matter his life purchased with her freedom. She spent the morning writing letters, one to Ayana, explaining her decision, one to Pierre and Celeste, thanking them for their kindness, and one to Captain Blackwood that she intended to deliver personally. The words came slowly, each sentence feeling like another link in the chain she was forging around her own future. But by the time she finished, her resolve was unshakable. She waited until Pierre and Celeste left for their weekly trading meeting with the local farmers, then slipped out of the house with her small bundle of belongings. The letter she left on her bed where they would be found, along with the blue dress Celeste had given her. Instead, she wore the buckskin outfit Ayana had made for her during their travels, the clothes that belonged to the person she had become in his company. Not the person others wanted her to be. The ride to the nearest army outpost would take her 2 days if she pushed hard and didn't stop for more than a few hours of rest. She had learned enough from Ayana about reading the land and finding water that she believed she could make the journey safely. And once she reached the fort, she would find Captain Blackwood and tell him everything. Emma was saddling one of Pierre's gentler horses when a voice behind her made her freeze. "Going somewhere, ma petite?" She turned to find Ayana standing in the stable doorway, his dark eyes taking in her travel clothes and the determined set of her shoulders. He had returned early from checking the trap lines, and from his expression, he had already spoken with Baptiste about the letter from the governor. "You know about the soldiers," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "I know that running away will not solve this problem," Ayana replied, stepping into the stable and closing the door behind him. "And I know that whatever you are planning will likely make things worse, not better." Emma lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it. That I chose to go with you, that you never kidnapped anyone, that every decision was mine." Ayana's face went very still. "Emma, no, you cannot do this. It's the only way to save you," she said firmly. "If I confess that I was never kidnapped, they can't hang you for a crime that never happened. They will never believe you," Ayana said, moving closer with the careful movements of someone approaching a spooked animal. "You are a child in their eyes. They will assume I corrupted you, turned you against your own people. My fate will be the same, but yours will be worse." "Maybe," Emma admitted. "But at least you'll be alive. At least you'll have a chance." Ayana reached out and gently took the reins from her hands. "And what of your life, your future? You would sacrifice everything, your safety, your freedom, any hope of happiness to save a man who chose his own path?" "Yes," Emma said simply, "because I love you." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning unseen for months. Emma had not planned to say them, but now that they were spoken, she felt no desire to take them back. They were true, perhaps the truest thing she had ever said. Ayana's hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment, Emma saw all his careful control crack, just enough for her to glimpse the depth of emotion he had been fighting to contain. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with suppressed feeling, "you cannot love me. Not the way you think you do. You are grateful to me for saving your life, and you have confused that gratitude with something deeper. But love, real love, requires understanding consequences, accepting sacrifices. You are too young to comprehend what loving me would cost you. Stop telling me I'm too young." Emma flared, her composure finally breaking under the weight of weeks of frustration. "Stop deciding what I can and cannot feel. I've made my own choices since I was 12 years old, and I'll make this one too. I know exactly what I'm sacrificing, and I know exactly why. Do you?" Ayana challenged. "Do you understand that if you confess to choosing me willingly, you will be branded as a woman of loose morals for the rest of your life? That no respectable family will take you in, no decent man will marry you? Do you understand that you will be completely alone in a world that offers women like you only two paths: prostitution or poverty?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "Do you understand that none of that matters to me if you're dead?" The raw honesty in her voice seemed to hit Ayana like a physical blow. He turned away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is impossible," he muttered. "You are 13 years old, I am 30. You are white, I am Indian. Even if we could somehow escape this immediate danger, what future could we have? What life could we build together that would not destroy us both?" "The same life we were building before we came here," Emma replied. "The same future we talked about in those hidden valleys where people make their own rules. You said yourself that some hearts find home where no one else thought to look." Ayana spun around to face her, and Emma was shocked to see tears glistening in his dark eyes. "You remember everything, don't you? Every word, every moment." "Everything," Emma confirmed. softly. Including the way you looked at me the night we left your camp. Including the way your voice changed when you told me about your daughter. Including the way you touched my face 3 nights ago and told me you loved me too. I never said. You didn't have to say the words, Emma interrupted. I could see it in your eyes. I could feel it in the way you held me when we rode through the night. You love me, Ayana. Maybe not the way you think you should. Maybe not the way the world says is proper, but you love me, and I love you. And everything else, age, race, society's expectations, is just noise. Ayana stared at her for a long moment, and Emma could see him warring with himself, torn between the truth of what she was saying and the weight of every social barrier that stood between them. Even if what you say is true, he said finally. Even if what we feel for each other is real and deep and lasting, we cannot act on it. Not now, not for years. You are still a child, Emma, no matter how brave and mature you seem. And I am still a man with enough honor left to know the difference between love and the corruption of innocence. Emma felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. Then what do you suggest? That we pretend these feelings don't exist? That we go back to being guardian and ward, trading partner and adopted daughter, anything except what we really are? To each other? I suggest, Ayana said quietly, that we find a third option. One that doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself to save me, and doesn't require us to live a lie about what we mean to each other. What kind of third option? Ayana was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities. When he spoke again, his voice carried the tone of a man who had just made a decision that would change everything. We run, he said simply. Not just from this immediate danger, but from everything. We disappear completely, become different people in a different place. There are territories opening up in the far west where no one asks questions about the past, where mixed couples can blend in among all the other displaced souls seeking new starts. Emma felt her heart leap with hope. You mean it? We could really leave everything behind? Everything, Ayana confirmed. Your name, my name, our histories, our people's expectations. We would become whoever we choose to be, and we would wait however long it takes for you to grow into the woman you are becoming. And when that day comes, when you are old enough to make a choice that the world might accept, we would choose each other freely and completely. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and would require them to live as fugitives for years. But it was also the first real hope Emma had felt since Baptist had read the governor's letter. What about the soldiers coming here? She asked. What? About Captain Blackwood's investigation? Let them come, Ayana said with grim satisfaction. They will find that Emma Rousseau and Joseph Ayana have simply vanished, along with 2 horses and enough supplies for a long journey. They can search the territory for months if they like, but they will be looking for people who no longer exist. Emma stepped closer to him, close enough to see the determination replacing the doubt in his dark eyes. And who will we become? Ayana reached out and gently touched her face, the gesture achingly familiar and yet somehow different no longer. A farewell, but a promise. We will become whatever we choose to be, he said softly. A family seeking homestead land in Oregon territory. A trader and his daughter heading for the California goldfields. 2 souls who belong to each other, and no one else. Emma covered his hand with hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life, feeling the warmth that had become her definition of safety. When do we leave? She asked. Tonight, Ayana replied. Under cover of darkness while the trading post sleeps. By the time anyone realizes we're gone, we'll be days ahead of any pursuit. As they stood together in the dim light of the stable, Emma felt the last vestiges of her childhood falling away like a shed skin. She was choosing a path that would cut her off from everything she had ever known, that would make her an outcast. From respectable society, that would condemn her to years of hiding and uncertainty, but she was also choosing love over safety, truth over convenience, and the man who had seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only a burden to be disposed of. Tomorrow, Emma Hartwick and Ayana would cease to exist. In their place would be 2 new people with new names and a new story, bound together by choices that could never be unmade, and a love that had grown strong enough to survive anything the world might throw at them. The masquerade was finally over. Now the real adventure could begin. The Oregon territory stretched before them like a promise written in gold and green, its valleys carved deep by rivers that had never known the touch of steamboat paddles or the weight of railroad bridges. 5 years had passed since the night Emma and Ayana had vanished from Baptist trading post, and the 2 people who now rode toward the settlement of Willow Creek bore only the faintest resemblance to the desperate fugitives who had fled. Nebraska in the darkness. Emma, who now answered to the name Grace Sullivan, sat her horse with the confident posture of someone who had spent years in the saddle. At 18, she had grown tall and willowy, her blonde hair now reaching past her shoulders and gleaming like spun gold in the afternoon sunlight. The awkward angles of adolescence had given way to the graceful curves of womanhood, and her green eyes held a depth of experience that would have been impossible in the frightened 13-year-old who had once refused to leave her father's grave. Beside her rode the man she knew as Daniel Sullivan, though she sometimes still caught herself thinking of him as Ayanna in the quiet moments when memory overtook present reality. The years had touched him more lightly, a few threads of silver in his black hair, deeper lines around his dark eyes, but still the same quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. To the world, they were father and daughter, Irish immigrants seeking their fortune in the Oregon goldfields. To each other, they were something far more complicated and precious. "There it is," Daniel said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley where two streams converged. "Willow Creek, our new home, if we choose to make it so." Grace studied the settlement with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to evaluate communities quickly and thoroughly. They had lived in a dozen different places over the past 5 years, mining camps in California, farming settlements in the Washington Territory, trading posts along the Columbia River, never staying long enough to put down real roots, never allowing themselves to become too comfortable or too visible, always moving before questions could be asked or patterns noticed. But Willow Creek looked different from the rough frontier towns they had grown accustomed to. The buildings were well constructed, with gardens and orchards that spoke of people planning to stay for generations rather than just long enough to extract wealth from the land. There was a church with a proper steeple, a schoolhouse with children playing in the yard, and what appeared to be a newspaper office with actual glass windows. "It looks permanent," Grace said, and Daniel heard both hope and worry in her voice. You ready for permanent?" he asked, the question carrying layers of meaning they had both been avoiding for months. Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the smoke rising from the chimneys of Willow Creek, seeing the domestic tranquility that had always felt just beyond their reach. "I think I'm ready to try," she said finally. They had been having this conversation in various forms for the better part of a year, the question of whether they could finally stop running, stop hiding, stop living as if their love were a crime, requiring constant vigilance. Grace was now 18, legally an adult by any standard. The passionate 13-year-old who had declared her love in Baptist stable had become a woman with the wisdom to understand the complexities of that declaration, but also the maturity to know that her feelings had only deepened with time. Daniel had kept his promise to wait, to allow her to grow into her own choices without pressure or manipulation. Their relationship over the past 5 years had been carefully platonic. He had been her teacher, protector, and companion, but never her lover, no matter how much they both sometimes ached with the effort of maintaining that boundary. But now, with Grace legally adult and emotionally mature, the question that had been suspended between them for so long could no longer be avoided. As they rode into Willow Creek, Grace found herself studying the women they passed, wives hanging laundry, mothers calling children in for supper, elderly ladies tending flower gardens with the patience of those who had found their place in the world. For 5 years, she had lived outside such domestic contentment, always on the periphery of other people's settled lives. The prospect of finally claiming such happiness for herself was both thrilling and terrifying. They found lodging at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a tidy establishment run by a widow who asked few questions as long as the rent was paid promptly. Grace took a room on the 2nd floor, while Daniel rented a smaller room in the attic, maintaining the fiction of their familial relationship, even as both of them were acutely aware that the fiction was wearing thin. "Will you be staying long?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she showed them to their accommodations. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and the slightly lonely manner of someone who genuinely enjoyed the company of her boarders. "We hope so," Grace replied. "My father is looking for investment opportunities in the valley, and I'm hoping to find work as a teacher or seamstress." "A teacher!" Mrs. Henderson exclaimed with obvious delight. "Oh, my dear, you'll be very welcome. Here, our current schoolmarm is getting married next month and moving to Portland. The school board has been quite worried about finding a replacement, especially someone with proper education and refinement." Grace glanced at Daniel, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. This was exactly the kind of opportunity they had been hoping for, a chance for Grace to establish herself as a respectable member of the community, creating the foundation for a life that could eventually accommodate their true relationship. That evening, as they dined in Mrs. Henderson's parlor with the other boarders, Grace found herself slipping easily into the role of Daniel Sullivan's accomplished daughter. She spoke knowledgeably about literature and mathematics, demonstrated her facility with languages by conversing briefly in French with a visiting merchant, and charmed the assembled company with her combination of education and frontier practicality. Daniel watched her with a mixture of pride and something deeper, the recognition that the woman she had become was everything he had hoped for during those long years of waiting. She was intelligent, confident, and capable of navigating complex social situations with grace. More importantly, she had retained the essential core of fierce loyalty and moral courage that had first drawn him to her beside her father's grave. After dinner, they walked along the main street of Willow Creek, ostensibly so Daniel could evaluate potential business opportunities, but really so they could have the first private conversation they had managed since arriving. The teaching position would be perfect, Grace said as they passed the schoolhouse. It would give me standing in the community, financial independence, and a reason to be here that has nothing to do with you. And that's important to you? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Essential, Grace replied firmly. When we stop pretending to be father and daughter. I need people to see me as Grace Sullivan, the schoolteacher, not as some woman who trapped an older man through improper means. I need them to respect me as an individual before they can accept us as a couple. Daniel nodded, understanding the wisdom in her approach, even as he chafed against the necessity of continued deception. 5 years of hiding their true feelings had taken its toll on both of them, but especially on Grace, who had been forced to suppress her natural affections during the crucial years, when most young women were learning to navigate courtship and romance. How long do you think it will take? He asked. To establish yourself, I mean. Grace considered the question seriously. A year, perhaps 2. Long enough for people to see my character, to trust my judgment. Long enough for any gossip about our age difference to be overshadowed by evidence of our genuine affection and mutual respect. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the future they were finally daring to envision. The evening air was sweet with the scent of apple blossoms from the orchards surrounding the town, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from the houses they passed. Grace, Daniel said suddenly, using her assumed name but putting enough emphasis on it to remind them both that it was assumed. Are you certain this is what you want? Not just the teaching position, but everything else. The life we've been planning, talking about, you could still choose differently. You're young, beautiful, educated. You could have any man in this territory, could build a conventional life with someone who wouldn't require you to explain our unconventional beginning. Grace stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes serious in the lamplight from the street corner where they stood. Do you remember, she said quietly, what you asked me the night we left the trading post? You asked if I was ready for permanent. Daniel nodded. I've been thinking about that question for 5 years, Grace continued. Not just about being ready to stop running, but about what permanent means. What it means to choose one person, one life, one path and commit to it completely. She stepped closer, close enough that anyone watching would have seen nothing more than a daughter speaking earnestly to her father. But Daniel could see the woman in her eyes, the depth of feeling that no familial relationship could contain. I know exactly what I'm choosing, Grace said firmly. I'm choosing the man who honored my father's memory, when he could have left us both to the scavengers. I'm choosing the man who gave up his home and his people rather than abandon me to strangers. I'm choosing the man who kept his promise to let me grow into my own decisions, even when keeping that promise cost him 5 years of loneliness. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides with the effort of not reaching for her. Grace, I'm choosing the man I've loved since I was 13 years old, she continued, her voice unwavering. The man I'll still love when I'm 90. The man who taught me that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the last of his resistance crumble under the weight of her certainty. The world will still judge us, he said quietly. People will still whisper about the Indian man who married a white woman, about the age difference, about how we came to be together. Let them whisper, Grace replied with a flash of the defiance that had sustained her through every trial they had faced. We've survived worse than gossip. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at the woman she had become. Beautiful, yes, but more than that. Strong, determined, capable of making her own choices and living with the consequences. The frightened child who had clung to her father's body had become someone who could face down an entire judgmental world. Without flinching. When? He asked simply. "When I've proven myself here," Grace replied. "When the community knows me well enough to see past the scandal to the person I really am. When you've established your business and shown them the man you really are. When we can stand before them not as objects of curiosity or pity, but as two people who belong together." Daniel nodded slowly. It was a sensible plan, one that would give them the best possible chance of building a life that could withstand external pressure. But more than that, it was Grace's plan, born of her own wisdom and implemented on her own timeline. After 5 years of protecting her from consequences she wasn't ready to face, he was finally seeing the woman she had always been destined to become, someone strong enough to protect herself. 2 years, he said, making it both a question and a promise. 2 years, Grace agreed. And then Grace Sullivan the schoolteacher will marry Daniel Sullivan the merchant, and everyone will say what a lovely couple they make. They shared a smile that held 5 years of patience and promises, 5 years of love carefully contained and finally ready to be released. The masquerade wasn't quite over yet, but its end was finally in sight. As they turned to walk back toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Grace slipped her arm through Daniel's in a gesture that could have been filial affection, but felt like so much more. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, job interviews, business opportunities, the careful work of building a life solid enough to support the weight of their unconventional love. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, they could walk through the world knowing that their exile was almost over, that the future they had sacrificed everything to protect was finally within reach. The seasons that followed passed like pages in a carefully written book, each one building toward the conclusion that Grace and Daniel both knew was inevitable. Grace proved herself to be an exceptional teacher, beloved by her students and respected by their parents for her dedication and innovative methods. Daniel established a successful trading business, importing goods from California and exporting the valley's agricultural products to markets throughout the territory. More importantly, they both became integral parts of the Willow Creek community. Grace organized literacy classes for adult women, started a lending library, and helped establish a fund for families struggling with medical expenses. Daniel served on the town council, mediated disputes between neighbors, and used his connections with various Indian tribes to negotiate peaceful trade relationships that benefited everyone. By the end of their first year, people stopped thinking of them as strangers who had happened to settle in Willow Creek and began thinking of them as neighbors whose presence had enriched the community. The careful distance they maintained from each other was attributed to Daniel's respect for his daughter's independence and Grace's proper upbringing, rather than to the passionate feelings they were still working to conceal. The transformation of their relationship from hidden love affair to accepted courtship began so gradually that most people later claimed they had seen it coming from the beginning. It started with Daniel escorting Grace to community social events, continued with quiet walks after church services, and progressed to Sunday dinners where other couples would join them in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. By the time Daniel formally asked Grace to marry him in front of half the town at the annual Harvest Festival, their engagement surprised no one. The age difference that might have caused scandal in a larger city was hardly worth mentioning in a frontier community where practical compatibility mattered more than social conventions. Their wedding was held on a crisp October morning in the Willow Creek Church with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself, decorated with lace that Daniel had imported specially from San Francisco. Daniel wore his finest suit, but Grace noticed that he also wore the silver and bone choker that had belonged to his Odawa heritage, a small acknowledgement of the identity he had sacrificed, but never entirely abandoned. As they stood before Reverend Matthews and exchanged vows they had been waiting 5 years to speak aloud, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened child who had refused to leave her father's grave had become a woman confident enough to choose her own path. The exiled warrior who had sacrificed everything to save a stranger's daughter had become a respected member of a community that valued his contributions. They had reinvented themselves completely, becoming new people with new names and new stories. But at the core of their transformation was something that had never changed, the recognition that they belonged together, that their love was worth any sacrifice, any struggle, any price the world demanded. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, when Daniel lifted Grace's veil and kissed her with 5 years of carefully contained passion, when the church bells rang out across the valley to announce the beginning of their new life, Grace knew that they had finally achieved what had seemed impossible that night in Baptist Stable. They had found a way to love each other openly, completely, and forever. The reception lasted until well past midnight, with dancing and feasting. and toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the evening progressed. But the moment Grace treasured most came much later, when she and Daniel finally escaped to the small house he had built for them on the outskirts of town. As they stood together on their front porch, looking out over the valley that had become their home, Grace felt the last vestiges of fear and uncertainty finally fade away. They had played their parts perfectly, had convinced the world to accept them on their own terms. But more importantly, they had never lost sight of who they really were beneath the roles they had been forced to play. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched the moon rise over the mountains. "The choices we made, the life we gave up to have this one." Grace considered the question seriously, thinking about the conventional path she had abandoned, the respectable future she had traded for an uncertain adventure with a man the world told her she shouldn't love. "Never," she said firmly. "I regret that we had to hide for so long, that we had to pretend to be something we weren't. But I've never regretted choosing you, choosing this life, choosing love over safety." Daniel pulled her closer, and Grace marveled at how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to finally be able to show the world the affection they had been hiding for so long. "Mrs. Sullivan," Daniel said softly, testing out her new name. "Mr. Sullivan," Grace replied, laughing at the strangeness of it after years of careful formality. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found their way home to each other despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new chapters in the story they were writing together. But tonight, they were simply Grace and Daniel Sullivan, husband and wife, beginning the life they had been brave enough to choose and patient enough to claim. In the distance, a wolf howled, not with loneliness, but with the wild satisfaction of a creature that had found its pack. Grace smiled at the sound, remembering another night when she had ridden through darkness toward an uncertain future, trusting in the strength of the man beside her and the power of love to overcome impossible odds. That trust had been rewarded beyond her wildest dreams. And this, she knew, was only the beginning.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.